What happens when art and suffering collide and no one cares enough to notice? When your craft feels misunderstood, unseen, and leaves you trapped in isolation. Franz Kafka's masterpiece, A Hunger Artist, is a story with profound meaning tucked behind its unsettling premise. And today, we're exploring why this haunting tale of fasting, obsession, and neglect might just be more relevant than ever. But first, let's talk about the basics. A hunger artist might sound like it belongs in the realm of surreal art or experimental theater, but in Kafka's world, it's a story with real, tangible pain at its core. Imagine this: a performer who starves himself as his act. He's not a magician, not a dancer. His entire art centers on fasting, locked away in a cage for public viewing. What's the goal? Well, according to the story, it isn't fame, it isn't wealth. It's something much stranger and darker. At the start of the tale, the hunger artist is a sensation. He's celebrated, crowds flock to gape at him. His cage becomes a fixture in city squares, meticulously monitored by spectators and officials to verify his fast. Everyone watches with eagerness, fascinated by his frail stature and extraordinary willpower. But quickly, cracks form in his relationship with the audience. Even in his moments of triumph, the spectators don't grasp the true essence of his fasting. And here's where it gets heartbreaking. Over time, those once curious crowds begin to lose interest. Despite his obsession, his ability to turn fasting into an almost spiritual pursuit, the hunger artist shifts into obscurity, eventually performing for scraps on the fringe. A fading novelty tucked into the corners of a traveling circus. Now, you'd think the story would stop there, tragedy enough for one man who dedicated his life to misunderstood art. But Kafka pulls no punches. At the circus, viewers ignore him, their attention stolen by the captivating animals nearby. The artist is almost invisible now. Here's the gut punch. Even as his health wanes, even as his death inches closer, the real reason behind his fasting emerges. The hunger artist confesses, moments before he dies, that he has never fasted out of dedication to art, spectacle, or discipline. He simply couldn't find any food he liked. As indifferent onlookers remove his lifeless body from the cage, they replace it with a panther, bursting with vitality and beauty. And the crowds? They flock to the cage once again. Dark, right? Uncomfortable, existential, pure Kafka. But let's rewind for a moment and ask, what is this story really trying to say? Why do readers return to A Hunger Artist time and again, feeling its weight even decades after it was written? And more importantly, why is it more relevant now than ever? Let's break it down. At its heart, A Hunger Artist tackles the timeless tension between an artist's vision and their audience's understanding, or lack thereof. The hunger artist isn't just a character. He's a metaphor for anyone who has ever felt alienated by their desire to create. His fasting, his suffering, and his attention to every meticulous detail represent a pure form of artistic dedication. But here's the catch: the audience doesn't get it. They applaud, but they don't understand. They treat his art as spectacle, something to consume briefly before moving on to the next shiny thing. Sound a little familiar? In today's digital world where content often feels disposable, art and authenticity can be drowned in the endless scroll of entertainment. But it goes even deeper. Isolation isn't just emotional for the hunger artist, it's physical. The very act of fasting places him inside an iron-barred cage. While meant to display his art, the cage underscores his separation from others. He's locked away, observed but never connected. This isn't just Kafka's way of talking about creative struggle. It's a critique of how society isolates people who reject convention, whose lives don't conform neatly to the molds expected of them. For artists, thinkers, and anyone who dares to live outside the normal, isolation becomes the price of their vision. What's so chilling about this story is its commentary on suffering. For Kafka, suffering has always been tangled with meaning, but here, it leads nowhere. The hunger artist sacrifices everything for fasting, turning it into his life's work, but there's no reward. When he dies, no legacy remains of his suffering. No one even remembers why he fasted in the first place. Kafka doesn't let us escape into comforting illusions. Instead, he reminds us that pain or sacrifice aren't inherently meaningful unless they connect to something greater. And for the artist, that connection never comes. He's alone, lost in a world that simply doesn't care. And then there's the circus. Oh, the circus. A dream-crushing backdrop where the story's thematic punch lands squarely. The circus isn't just a spectacle. It's a critique of society itself. Just as the circus audience rushes to the panther, abandoning the cage where the fasting artist once sat, so too do we gravitate toward vivid, exciting, immediate pleasure instead of introspection or challenge. The panther feels alive, the artist's suffering feels cold. We want vitality, energy, not quiet sacrifice. Kafka saw this in his own time, as shifting entertainment preferences left many forms of high art undervalued, and the same applies today. Modern society is obsessed with speed, spectacle, and surface-level excitement, leaving little room for artists who create slowly, painfully, and without flashy results. But perhaps the most relatable element of a hunger artist is its fixation on perfectionism. The hunger artist isn't obsessed with fame or money. In fact, he's not even really obsessed with art. What drives him ultimately is finding the right reason to eat, the perfect satisfaction he's never able to achieve. It's a tragic parody of an unattainable ideal. Doesn't that sound familiar? How often does perfectionism lead us down paths of isolation, exhaustion, and self-destruction, not because we're doing something wrong, but because the ideal itself is impossible? So, why is a hunger artist more relevant now than ever? Look around. As society becomes fixated on consuming content at record speeds, many artists ask, is anyone truly paying attention? How many hours, weeks, years are poured into crafts that the modern world barely stops to admire? Isolation is no longer confined to barred cages. It's everywhere, from the loneliness of chasing impossible goals to digital spaces that foster image over introspection. And suffering, alas, often seems to happen in silence, meeting indifference rather than understanding. But before you sink into despair, remember Kafka's story is also a mirror. Yes, A Hunger Artist critiques our tendencies toward neglecting the deep and favoring the shallow, but it also forces us to look inward. Why do we connect or disconnect from art? Are we guilty of snapping up spectacle while ignoring substance? And, most importantly, how can we create a world where even the quietest forms of art find their recognition? The story's relevance lies not just in its tragedy, but in its challenge, to rethink how we view meaning, effort, and connection. So, what do you think? Was Kafka's hunger artist a misunderstood genius, lost to a shallow world, or was his suffering tragically pointless from the start? Sound off in the comments below, and let us know your take. And hey, before you go, don't forget to like this video, hit that subscribe button, and ring the bell for more literary deep dives just like this one.